Welcome to another grammar lecture with Professor Dennis. This segment, you will learn about comma usage. Why? Because comma abuse is the most common mistake I see in student writing. They either forget to put it in, or they have way too many of them, resulting in a run-on sentence. For this reason, it's extremely important that you learn where the commas go and why they go there. If you don't, it can be really hard to decipher what it is that you're trying to say, and your audience can get lost and confused. No matter which way your writing might be right now, too many or too few, know that the comma is more important than you might think. Like this sample. Without the proper commas, we have a pet-eating cannibal on the loose. Before we dig in, it's important for you to know that punctuation is really meant to mimic human speech patterns. Exclamation points denote excitement, and question marks tell us that there was something to ponder and answer. And the commas are like the pauses we take when we speak. The comma helps you to know that there should be a slight pause before you progress. That pause is also a cue to your audience about how the ideas are supposed to flow together and how they connect. The period tells us that the thought ends altogether. So if that's the case, where does this tricky little piece of punctuation really belong in your writing? The most important takeaway for you this time to understand is when and where that comma is needed. It helps to connect independent clauses when used with a coordinating conjunction. It offsets introductory words, phrases, and clauses. They go around a name when you're addressing a specific individual. They help to offset extra phrases. And they're even used to offset subordinate clauses at the start of a sentence or ones embedded in the middle of the sentence. Finally, it's needed when you have a list of 3 or more items, and we're going to be covering the controversial Oxford comma in depth at the end. The first way to use the comma is to connect 2 independent clauses. I'm going to read you the first sample with no comma exactly how the brain would translate this if it were on the page. I was excited for my next big publication, for it held many hidden truths about my life. Did you get a little lost? That's okay. That comma adds more meaning than you might think. Now I'm going to read the same sentence with the comma firmly in place. I was excited for my next big publication, for it held many hidden truths about my life. Did you hear the difference? Was the sentence easier to follow this time? Another use for the comma is to offset introductory words, phrases, and clauses. I have 3 different samples here. I'm going to read each one as if there were no commas, and then as it's written with the comma. I want you to listen closely to the difference and see which one sounds better. Finally, the professor finished her lecture and ended class. Or, finally, the professor finished her lecture and class ended. Sentence 2. At the end of the class, the professor had us complete a writing prompt. Or, at the end of the class, the professor had us complete a writing prompt. Final sentence. Despite her best efforts, the students still did not use the grammar the professor was teaching. Or, despite her best efforts, the students still did not use the grammar the professor was teaching. Which one had a more satisfying feel to you as an audience? The way you write is actually much the same. When you write with correct comma usage, your reader will have that same ah feeling. The next aspect of comma usage is for addressing an individual. When you address an individual, you're interrupting your sentence, so this type of name usage acts as an interjection. It's inserted so that the correct person knows who's being spoken to in that moment, but it's not needed unless you want that particular person to know they're the ones you're speaking directly to. Listen to each of these samples without the comma, and then listen to them with the comma. When you think about it, Angel, it's really all about timing. Or, when you think about it, Angel, it's really all about timing. Sentence 2. Really, Althea, do you have to bark that loudly? Or, really, Althea, do you have to bark that loudly? Which ones sound better or more correct to you? By now, I hope you're catching on to the extra meaning one little comma can put into a sentence. It really is more than just a curvy little line. If that's not enough reason for you to have that lovely little comma where it matters when addressing someone, please remember that we don't want to cook our friends. In this sentence, without that comma, that's exactly what you end up doing. Learn how to cut, marinate, and cook friends. If this is how you punctuate, remind me not to come over to your house for dinner. However, if you want to add that extra little comma, learn how to cut, marinate, and cook friends. I think I might consider coming over then. Next, we have commas offsetting extra phrases of information. Here I have one sentence. In the first instance, the commas have been forgotten. In the second, they're exactly where they should be. What I'd like for you to do is listen closely as I read each one. My older sister, a nursing student, has seen a spike in COVID cases among the vaccinated. Or, my older sister, a nursing student, has seen a spike in COVID cases among the vaccinated. Which one sounded like the meaning was really enhancing the sentence, and which one sounded like it might have been bogged down? We've already covered subordinate clauses and how they have to attach to independent clauses to make complete sentences. If you need a refresher on that one, please review the segment on clauses and sentence structures. If you're pretty well versed, or as well versed as you can be for now, then let us press forward. There are only two types of subordinate clauses that will require the use of a comma, and they both have to do with location. If the subordinate clause comes first, it needs to have a comma. If the subordinate clause interrupts part of the independent clause to add new information, it needs offset by commas, one at the start and one to signal the end. You will not need a comma if the subordinate clause is the last thing in the sentence and can easily be switched between the front of the sentence and the back of the sentence without changing the meaning. Clear as mud? I thought it might be. Let's take a look at some samples where the subordinate clause does need to have commas. In this first sample, we have a subordinate clause that comes first. I'm going to read it without the comma, and then I'll read it with the comma. See if you can catch the difference between the two. If you were in my class, you should be taking notes. Or, if you were in my class, you should be taking notes. Which one had you thinking, wait, what? And which one was smooth and understandable? Now let's try one where the subordinate clause interrupts part of the independent clause. I'm going to read this sample without the commas in place, and then I'll read it with the commas as it should be. My older sister who works in healthcare has seen a spike in COVID cases among the vaccinated. Or, my older sister who works in healthcare has seen a spike in COVID cases among the vaccinated. Which one made better sense or sounded more correct? If you wonder why I keep asking about how it sounded instead of how it looks, that goes back to the idea that punctuation is meant to mimic our spoken word. Many of you have been able to listen to language from birth. So for those who can hear and have been able to since birth, your ear is already trained for where the comma goes. You just didn't know it. Or maybe you did. But it's been too long, and so a refresher helps you to kind of reconnect those dots. An example for you of when a comma is not needed for a subordinate clause is when the clause is the last thing in the sentence, and the clause can be moved to the front without changing the meaning. Listen as I read this sample. I enjoyed reading all of the comments because they gave me insights into my students' lives. You'll notice that it sounds correct without that pause. But what happens if I move that subordinate clause to the front and I don't put the comma? Because they gave me insights into my students' lives, I enjoyed reading all of their comments. Or, because they gave me insights into my students' lives, I enjoyed reading all of their comments. Did you hear the pause there? And did the sentence still make sense? If you answered that it did, you would be correct. This is also one way you can play around with language in writing. Just make sure you have the comma if the subordinate clause comes first. I deliberately saved the best for last, the Oxford comma. There's a substantial amount of controversy surrounding this type of a comma. The Oxford comma is used when you have a list of 3 or more items. It's the comma that goes just before the coordinating conjunction, or the final item in the list. What's the big deal? It's just a comma, right? Actually, it's so much more than that. Because the comma is there to show that things are in a concise list, it shows that the last item in the list is part of the list as its own item and not combined with the item just before it. Why might you need this? In most cases, you might not. However, there have been legal cases that have been won or lost on the placement, misplacement, or exclusion of a single comma alone. So what's the big deal with the Oxford comma, aka the serial comma? Not all writing styles require it. So why make such a big fuss? The answer is because the Oxford comma can help to avoid ambiguity. Ambiguity in writing leaves a gray area that could leave you or your company of employment open for a potential disaster. One such case comes out of Maine with a class action lawsuit for the drivers of Oakhurst Dairy. The neglect of one little comma cost the company $10 million. That's right, one little curvy line cost a grand total of $10 million. Let that number sink in for a moment. I have the exact line in question here for you to examine. From this, we can see that there's a parallel structure list with ing. Because there's no comma between shipment and the word or, there was ambiguity. It could be read 2 different ways. The canning, process, preserving, freezing, marketing, storing, packing for shipment or distribution of, or the canning, processing, preserving, freezing, marketing, storing, packaging for shipment or distribution of. The company argued that the law was intended to list packing for shipment and distribution as 2 separate and exempt activities. The drivers argued that the law groups packing for shipment together in the same activity as distribution because there was no serial or Oxford comma. While it might not be habit for you to use the Oxford comma, or you might think that the Oxford comma is a waste of time and space, I would have to say that the court systems disagree, according to the rulings of the judge. If that exemption used a serial comma to mark off the last of the activities that it lists, then the exemption would clearly encompass an activity that the drivers perform. And in that event, the drivers would plainly fall within the exemptions and thus outside the overtime law protection. But, as it happens, there is no serial comma to be found in the exemptions list of activities, thus leading to this dispute over whether the drivers fall within the exemption from the overtime law or not. The result of not using an Oxford comma? $10 million. That is one expensive piece of punctuation. So with that in mind, let's look into the Oxford comma and how it's used for lists of 3 or more. For the list of 3 or more, let's look at this sample. The first sample has no commas. I'm going to read it without the pauses. And I want you to listen to see if you get lost in the flurry of words. He cut the grass, trimmed the hedge, and painted the fence. The next sample has what has become more popular today, although it ends up missing some of the same meaning because that pause is missing without that Oxford comma. This sample reads as, he cut the grass, trimmed the hedge, and painted the fence. The last reading has the Oxford comma. I want you to listen to the sample as I read it, exactly as it was meant to be read, with the Oxford comma, so that you can hear that pause. Listen carefully and see if you see the difference in meaning. And does it feel slightly different between this one and the previous one? He cut the grass, trimmed the hedge, and painted the fence. Now that you've read all three, which one sounds the way it was meant to be said? You said the third option with the Oxford comma, you would be correct. Since we've already looked into the legalities of the Oxford comma, let's look at a few fun examples to help you see this from the humorous standpoint. Because let's face it, humor always makes grammar just a tad more memorable. This meme has been circulating online for quite a while. You'll notice that the first sample tells you what was eaten at breakfast. The second sample has the speaker telling the toast and orange juice that he already ate the eggs. In other words, it sounds like the person is talking to their breakfast instead of eating it. While I know that everyone is smart enough to realize the difference when they read the sentence, it's not really the point. Don't believe me? Let's take a look at another sample that might help you to understand the importance of this piece of punctuation. This is one of my favorite memes because it really does show the importance of the Oxford comma. As the statement is written, we have someone who is saying that their parents are Superman and Wonder Woman. Well, that would be exceptionally cool to be able to claim. It's not exactly realistic. When you add the Oxford comma, you have, my heroes are my parents, Superman, and Wonder Woman, which is a concise list of 3 different heroes. I hope that by now you're realizing the importance of this one little comma, the Oxford comma, as it is referred to. If not, just think back to that court case that really showed how important this comma can be. I have here some bonus resources for you. They can be found in the segment as hyperlinks. The first 2 are websites that walk you through not only the comma, but also more complex ideas such as the semicolon and colon, for those who are a bit braver and want more of a challenge. Or for those who are repeatedly told in feedback that they need to use one in order to pair their sentences correctly. The third is an online PDF that covers the rules of these 3 types of punctuation in a fast and concise manner. And finally, the last one is a punctuation quiz for comma usage specifically. I hope that you found this helpful and enlightening and try not to make a $10 million mistake with your comma usage. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out using that email icon in the Learning Management System. Thanks so much, and I'll catch you on the flip side.